Welcome to Grandpa's True Scary Stories, where every story you hear was once real. Tonight's tale is a chilling, true paranormal story titled The Clock That Never Stopped Ticking. If you love true scary stories, haunted heirlooms, and curses that run in the blood like time itself, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because some clocks don't count seconds. They guard them. All right, let's begin. I inherited the clock from my grandfather because no one else wanted to hear it at night. That's not me being clever. That's what my aunt said at the reading of the will, quietly, like she was asking someone to prove her wrong. We divided the normal things: a brass lamp, a teapot with a hairline crack, a collection of postcards that smelled like old rain. And then there was the pocket watch that never stopped ticking. It wasn't technically a watch anymore. The chain was long gone, and the little bow at the crown had snapped, so it lived in a velvet-lined box that looked older than the rest of our family combined. My grandfather called it the clock because that's how he used it. Set on a saucer beside his bed, glass open, ticking loud enough to make you think of shoes in a hallway. I didn't fight for it. I just didn't step back when it rolled toward me. The watch was heavy and warm in my hand, the way metal gets warm when it's decided you're responsible. The face had a hairline crack from the 1 to the 3, like a wrinkle where the clock smiled too hard once. The second hand wasn't a hand so much as a red thread that moved in tiny, precise nods, never ever missing the next notch. Grandad used to knock the box with his knuckle and say, "You hear that? That's us not running out." I grew up thinking that was optimism. When I got older, I realized it was strategy. I brought the clock home in the kind of shoebox families use when they've already run out of tissues. I set it on my nightstand because that's where it had always lived, and for 20 minutes it did nothing but tick. A formal, old man kind of tick. Polite, like a librarian clearing their throat. Tick, tick, tick. The kind of ticking that makes you narrate your own thoughts to keep from counting. At some point, I fell asleep to it. At 3:12 a.m., because of course, it skipped. Not a stop. A skip, like a violinist's bow caught on a string and hopped to the next. The red thread jumped, the tick doubled to catch up, and for a breath, the room felt like an elevator that knew a floor you didn't. I put my hand on the lid like you pat a dog that's dreaming. The glass fogged under my palm and cleared, and the second hand showed me nothing except exactly where it had always planned to be. In the morning, I called my aunt and said, "Did Grandad ever talk to you about the clock skipping?" She said he talked around it. Then she lowered her voice without meaning to. He said it takes what it has to, so the rest can keep going. "That's not a comfort," I said. "It wasn't meant to be," she said. He kept it close on the nights the wind came down the hill. "What wind?" I asked. "The one with a name," she said, and then she made a small sound, like her mouth remembered our family rule about what we don't name. I told myself we were just the kind of people who put shapes under blankets. For a week, the clock ticked like it wanted to teach me a dance. I learned to sleep between ticks. I learned to wake up 1 second before the alarm. On the 8th night, 3:12 came, and the second hand hopped again. Not 1 notch, but 2. In the morning, my phone said a text had been sent from me at 3:12 to my ex. 3 words and a period like an obituary. "Are you awake?" I hadn't sent it. She hadn't answered. I stared at the bubble of it like I stare at a door I'm not going to open. and then left the phone face down on the table. Like that changed the sentence. By lunch, I convinced myself I'd pocket-dialed. That's what people do when the small, impossible thing sits on the plate and asks for salt. At dinner, I wound the clock. Not much. Grandad used to say, "Give it a drink, not a bath." The crown turned with that tight little friction that makes you think of teeth and gears and careful promises. I set it down and said out loud, "We're okay," which is what you say to rooms when you don't want to find out what they call you when you're not there. That night, I dreamed the old house on the hill. Not my house, the one I grew up visiting. The house my grandfather maintained with stubbornness and oil. In the dream, every door in the place was propped open with a pair of shoes, like someone had walked through and decided to leave their walking behind. In the parlour, an empty chair faced the big windows, and the watch sat on a saucer with 2 other watches beside it, ticking like 3 old men, arguing politely. I woke at 3:12 to the skip again. This time, 3 little hops, 1, 2, 3, like knocking on a coffin just to check. The room went thin and long, like the cold does when it thinks it's been invited inside. When the air settled, the clock ticked on like the polite librarian it had always been. I started keeping a notebook. You can laugh, but it's what we do when we need to prove to ourselves we're not insane. We keep a grid. Monday, tick steady, skip 2 at 3:12. Tuesday, steady, skip 3. Wednesday, steady, skip 1. Later the hallway light blinked on by itself and stayed at half bright like a person pretending to still be asleep. Thursday, I lost a whole minute looking at a photograph. Not metaphorically, lost. The red thread hopped, my stomach dropped like a misstep on stairs, and I blinked, and the coffee had cooled, and the sun was 2 finger widths higher on the sill. I called my aunt again. "Tell me the worst version of the story," I said. She breathed out hard. Then, "When I was little," she said, "your great-grandmother let me sleep in that parlour once, on the couch, because I had a fever and thought the couch would cure me faster." She set 3 watches on the table, all ticking at slightly different tempos, and she said, "As long as they argue, the house keeps the door shut." "What door?" She didn't answer that. "Your great-grandfather died on a night they forgot to wind them," she said instead, almost angry, like blame had found a place to sit down after all these years. "Your grandfather didn't forget again," she collected her voice. "He used to talk about the wind. The old folks named it when they were bored and a little magical. But he meant something else. He meant whatever leans against the walls when we're sleeping. He thought the watches were a way of paying attention so hard the thing got tired of trying." "Paying attention," I repeated. "That's the magic." "It was his," she said. "I just paid the light bill." I put the phone down and stared at the clock, like it was a good dog I suddenly suspected had eaten the neighbour's chicken. It ticked without looking at me. That night I brought the clock into the kitchen and set it on the table where there's more room for superstition. I found 2 other timekeepers just to be an idiot about it. A wind-up travel alarm from a junk shop and a kitchen timer shaped like a tomato. I set them all going at once. The room filled up with 3 ticks, each slightly rude to the others, overlapping in an argument that made a rhythm like rain against a shallow roof. "Okay," I told the kitchen. "All of you argue so hard nothing else can talk." At 3:12, my grandfather's clock hopped twice. The travel alarm hopped once, and the tomato, I swear, sighed. The window over the sink fogged and cleared as if it had been leaned on by a big patient face. When I woke in the chair, the sun was already higher than I liked, and the clock read the right time, and the tomato had stopped at 3:12 and refused to move. Not broken, done, a small retirement. At work, I lost 30 seconds in a meeting I was leading. Not attention, time. I was in the middle of saying, let's circle back, and then my hands were in a different place, and a man with a tie like a funeral had already said, we did. I checked my laptop clock. I checked my phone. The red thread of the pocket watch wasn't there, but I saw it anyway, behind my eyes, nodding twice, like it had agreed to something on my behalf. That night, I took the clock back to the old house. I didn't tell my aunt I was going. I didn't want her to show me what drawers the family kept the words in. The hill was the same as always, a fat old knee under a quilt. The house crouched like it was ready to spring every story at once. Inside, the air smelled like lemon oil and paper, because my aunt has good habits. The parlour had lost the grand piano years ago. The empty space where it once sat felt like a missing tooth your tongue can't stop finding. I set the clock on a saucer on the table. For company, I found 2 other clocks. The mantel one that wheezes, and a small, tarnished silver one from upstairs that thinks it's still wartime. I wound them all. The room filled with time, like a pond fills with minnows. All right, I said. Door shut. At 3:12, I'd stopped pretending that hour was going to surprise me. The wind came down the hill. Not weather, not a gust. It was a shape that has learned to move like weather, so we'll agree with it. The windows hummed in their frames as if the house had remembered the words to a song it didn't like. The 3 clocks argued as hard as clocks can. The red thread hopped once, then twice, then held. The mantel clock coughed a little and soldiered on. The wartime one ticked steady in a way that made me think of teeth in a careful jaw. And the door between the parlour and the hall moved. Not opened, moved, like a person keeping their hand on it, trying, then respecting the way a lock educates you. The latch clinked once, in the polite way people say after you when they mean not today. I was either brave or stupid. I stood, because if I'm going to get pushed, I'd rather meet the shove standing. I put my hand on the door above the latch. It was warm, which made no sense. The other side of fear is always the temperature you didn't expect. Not tonight, I said, hoping like a child hopes the right tone is a weapon. He kept it shut. I'm keeping it shut. The latch tapped back. Not angry, not even disappointed. The way you tap the top of a jar that will open on the 3rd try. I slept on the couch, but the room didn't let me. Every time I drifted, the red thread would hop once, and the feeling of an elevator missing a floor would turn me inside out. By dawn, the 3 clocks were still talking, and the hill looked like it had decided to sit in the sun and pretend it never had a night. I drove home with the clock on the passenger seat like a child. Every now and then, the second hand would hop, and the car would drift half an inch in the lane toward a world that didn't want us to merge. I gripped the wheel and told no one what I was doing. A narrator. I tried to give the clock back to my aunt. She shook her head so hard the earrings she only wears on court days clicked. He left it to you, she said. I'm not a place it wants to live. What if I'm not either? Then find someone who is, she said. And then she did something I will never forget and can't explain. She leaned toward the watchbox and said, "Not tonight," and the second hand made a small, embarrassed hop, like it had been caught eavesdropping. Narrator. The next week had the kind of small injuries time gives you when it's tired of being taken for granted. My oven clock showed 3:12 no matter the hour. I'd walk down the block and realize I'd skipped a driveway. My niece called me and said, "Uncle, you just told me that." And I said, "When?" And she said, "Just now." And we both laughed, because anything else makes the people who love you feel small. I took the clock to a watchmaker because that's what an adult does when he needs a man with a loop to tell him he's being silly. The shop was one of those narrow places with velvet mats and glass cases and light at the back that makes it feel like time stretches longer in there. The watchmaker wore a tie like an apology. He put the clock on his mat and opened the case with the tenderness of a man checking a sleeping child's breathing. "This is very old," he said, not looking at me, "and very stubborn." "Like the man who owned it," I said. He peered through the loop and hummed in the register people use when they want you to think they're considering options you can afford. Then he set the loop down and said, "I don't like it." "What's wrong?" "It's not keeping time," he said. "It's refusing to." "That's not a category," I said. "It is today," he said. "Look." He turned the face toward me. I watched the red thread hop, once, twice, and then backfill the hop with a tick that wasn't there. "It's losing seconds," I said. "No," he said. "It's losing you seconds." He closed the case and slid the clock back on the mat toward me like it had rolled on its own. "I won't wind it," he said. "And I won't take your money. I'll just tell you I don't like it." He raised his eyes. "If it were mine, I would hold it until whatever it's waiting for passes by." "What if it's waiting for me to put it down?" I asked. "Then you'll know," he said, "and you won't be late." That night I sat with the clock on my kitchen table and didn't wind it. I waited with it, which might be the only magic we've ever had in this family. At 3:12, the second hand hopped once, and then stopped on the 12 like a mouth closing on a sentence it shouldn't finish. The apartment got very quiet in the real way, not the fake kind the city gives you when your ears decide to be kind. I put my hand on the lid. The glass felt warmer than skin. The air over the stove pulled itself tight, then loosened, like someone had leaned on it with both hands to watch me. The hallway light clicked on at half bright, and from nowhere, not the radio, not the vents, I heard my grandfather's voice say, "You hear that? That's us not running out." I said, "I hear it." And the second hand moved again, tiny and polite, like all it wanted was me to answer roll call. I slept with the clock in my palm, like a child keeps a found stone. Morning came like the house had made peace with it. I didn't look at my phone for the thing that wasn't there anymore. The text bubble, the missed time, the step I didn't take. I made eggs like people do when they're practicing mercy for themselves. I put the clock back on the saucer and said, "Drink, not a bath," and gave it 3 little turns, which was all it asked for. If you think that's the end, you haven't lived in this family. We don't get endings, we get rhythms. 2 months later, the hill called in the voice of my aunt's neighbour. "The wind," he said, without saying the rest. "It's on the move." I drove up with the clock in the passenger seat and the sense that I had been here already a few times in a row. The house had its chin up, like old houses do when the young ones come by to see if they're still brave. Inside, the parlour felt taller, which is something rooms do when they're going to ask for more of you than you brought. I set the clock down and wound it. I found the mantle one and the wartime one and wound them too. I added the tomato for luck. The room filled with ticks, like a conversation between relatives who learned to forgive each other slower than everyone else. At 3:12, the wind came down the hill and the door moved, and I stood and put my hand on the latch and said, "Not today." From the other side of the door, a hand pressed back. I don't mean that as a metaphor. Wood warmed under my palm the way skin does when it promises to be good for one more minute. "Grandad?" I said, because the mouth reaches for the name it can say without being wrong. The latch tapped once. The red thread in the watch hopped twice and waited. "You can't come in," I said, gentle as I know how. "But you can sit with me." When the wind ran out of the energy to make a fool of me, the hill shrugged, the window panes found their song again, and the door cooled like a fever breaking. I carried the clock to the couch and put it on my chest and fell asleep hard. I woke at dawn to a room that had memorized me, and for the first time since the will, the clock ticked at the same tempo as my heart. I took it home, and I haven't wound it since. It still ticks, not because time needs me, but because I said okay out loud in a house that knows what that word costs. Sometimes, if I'm walking down a hallway at work and lose a second between steps, I don't panic. I let it go. I think that's for us. Sometimes, if I wake at 3:12, I put my hand on the nightstand and feel the warmth through the wood, and I say, "Not tonight." And I hear my grandfather's voice say, "Right on time." You can believe the clock is haunted if you want. You can believe it's a trick families play to have something to pass down besides the stories we don't tell. All I know is, when the second hand hops, I don't try to hold it back. I don't try to fix the part of me it borrows. I say, drink, not a bath, and let it take what it needs so the rest of us keep going. And on nights when the wind presses the building like a big polite palm, I set any little ticking things I have on the table and let them argue. Not because it keeps the door shut, though maybe it does, but because it reminds me we're still here, counting together, refusing to stop. If you ever visit and the room gets very quiet, you'll hear it. Not a loud tick, a modest one, a throat clear, a librarian. That's us not running out. The end. Thank you for listening to my story. If this tale kept you awake tonight, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because there are many more true scary stories, haunted heirlooms, and real nightmares waiting just past 3:12. This was Grandpa's True Scary Stories, where every whisper hides a truth, and every truth hides a nightmare.